Welcome to episode 4 of the Onside CFL Fantasy Football Podcast. As usual, lower your weapons by a Revolution engine, bringing us in the band of engineer Ben Bussey. A shout out to producer Dan Heidmarsh off the top of the show as well. And Dan the stats guy, oh boy, what a big week it is. The 2016 CFL Fantasy Football Guide is out.
People are excited to have it. I think one word that was used on Twitter this week was it's glorious. People have it in their hands and they can get ready for their different fantasy football leagues, and lots of names in there that people can go through and decide on who they're going to target. But not only for fantasy football fans, I'm getting word from a lot of people that just are casual fans that are finding it to be a good read. So yeah, we're excited to have it out and get it in people's hands.
Another good read you can follow along is our blog as well at onsidecfl.wordpress.com. We did put out a blog last week about catering out to the American viewer and trying to get them involved in fantasy football. So our desire as well would be to have them buy one of those guides too.
You know, you put a few points in there of guys that maybe have played in the NFL previously or were big names in college football in different programs across the United States. A lot of people kind of are coming on board with the CFL, with it playing on ESPN every week. So more and more Americans are coming on board, and Americans love their fantasy football. Hopefully we can get more involved this year on Fantasy and on the different fantasy engines.
Fantasy.ca is up and running again. As we have mentioned in the past, there are some changes this year. You can get your league going, and a season starts already in a couple of weeks. So last week we talked about how you should set up your draft, the round by round, when you should take a player, etc. This week, Dan, the stats guy, we figured, you know what? A common conception for a lot of fantasy owners is, who are the guys that I should avoid this year?
Yeah, we talked about some of the names that you should be targeting, and it is covered in the book of some of the guys that are going to be breakout guys. You're going to notice them with maybe not the same stats as last year, but having breakout seasons. We may get into that in later podcasts, but obviously when this podcast comes out, preseason's going to be starting, and the big names aren't going to be getting as much time, so you're going to be able to see some of the lesser names and see what they're doing. But we might as well talk about some of those big names, household names, that you would think are guys that you should just keep on going with. But I think there might be a few that there's a big word of caution with them.
As we have mentioned in the last show as well, the preseason games, you know, a lot of times the fair weather fan will say, why am I bother watching a preseason football game? But as a fantasy owner, before we get into the guys you should avoid, these are the games you should be watching if you do want to hashtag win your league.
Well, watch them. Also look at the stats. See who is getting a few more targets. See who's getting playing time, who's getting tackles, interceptions, all the different stats that are going to win you your league at each of the different positions. And as we've mentioned on past podcasts, make sure that you look at the Canadians and where they're fitting in, as teams are going to be using Canadians in different roles. And I know at different training camps, there's been a few Canadian players that maybe are moving around the field at different positions. And if one of them can find a starting job that nobody else knows about, you've got an advantage there.
By the time this show does go to air, it is on a Wednesday. That's the time that the Bombers and the Alouettes will go head-to-head, open up the preseason Wednesday, June 8th, and a couple of games on Saturday. A handful there. All right, let's get right into it. We talked about it. The guys that you probably want to avoid and that will frustrate you heading into the 2016 fantasy season. Well, one guy in particular, a BC Lion, which we did predict in our fantasy guide, he likely would have a bit of a ghost air quotes year.
Yeah, Lavelle Hawkins was a guy that we had talked about in the book, and people that have bought the book already will see that we do have stats down for him. We didn't completely update it in time, but Lavelle Hawkins on Monday announces his retirement from the BC Lions, and we had talked about it in the book. Lavelle Hawkins was a guy, he was recruited to the University of California by Jeff Tedford, recruited to the BC Lions by Jeff Tedford, and made a key point of the BC Lions offense last season, especially towards the last few games of the season, by Jeff Tedford. Obviously, Jeff Tedford is no longer the coach with the BC Lions, and so no longer is there maybe a role. Also, you look at his relationship, Lavelle Hawkins was very close with Austin Collie, another receiver of the Lions that retired earlier in the offseason. So Lavelle Hawkins on Monday is on his way out. There's a couple of rookies in BC, one that we have in the book, Geraldo Baldwin, a guy that I guess in one game last year, got in with the Lions and made a bit of an impression on some of the BC Lions fans. And he's a name to watch. Also, Kendrick Ings. We don't have him in the book as a name to watch for, but he's a rookie, did not play college football from what I understand. I think he's just a guy that, I don't know the whole story with it, but another sport player that's moved into football and had an NFL shot. Now he's back with the Lions looking for his opportunity. And then you have also the Canadians in BC with Sean Gore and Stephen Adekalu. A couple of guys that could have increased roles as a result of Lavelle Hawkins retiring.
Yeah, not to mention your meat and potatoes of the Brian Burnhams and guys like that, but we won't release too much more information. You want to go up and pick that fantasy football guide, but big knuckle tap to Dan for pulling that one out on Lavelle Hawkins as we were getting the guide ready. All right, Calgary Stampeders fans, we want to preface this next segment by saying we're Stampeders fans. We're fans of all 9 teams in the league, but we got 4 players in red and black that we think, and white, that you're going to want to avoid for the 2016 fantasy season. And this first one is a bit of a head scratcher because he was brought over from the Saskatchewan Roughriders late in 2015 season.
Well, yeah, you talk about Jerome Messam, I know you're a little bit more, I guess, down on Messam than I am. The reason I guess I would be down on Messam is that I see his receiving stats going down. I don't think the Stampeders are going to be throwing the ball to him as much out of the backfield, especially when you take into account their receiving group. You compare it to what he was faced with the Rough Riders last year, not the best receiving group as the season went on. And so Jerome Messam, as it went on and on and on, was getting more and more targets for passes out of the backfield. I think his rushing stats will be relatively the same, but you have to look at it from the overall perspective, and I just see Jerome Messam not having quite the same season, if only because of those receiving yards. How about you, Dave? How do you look at Jerome Messam's season this year?
I was just going to pick it up from you there. I think that the big thing, one of the big things that if by watching Messam over the last couple of years that you look at is his durability and his health. Is he in shape? Is he able to play a full 18-game season, a full 60 minutes? Is he able to go through and play a football game without having to sit off for half of it because he's being overworked? I know that Jerome Messam is a horse and he hauls in a lot of yards, and that's why they have the backups to come in and replace him. But, you know, this is fantasy football, so I won't get into the other particulars that I feel why the Calgary Stampeders will drop off. A lot of that does have to do with bringing Jerome Messam into the dressing room. So you put all that together, and I say Jerome Messam as a player, he will start the year as somebody who will probably stroke your fantasy libido and put you in a pretty good mood, but maybe a guy as the weeks lead on that you can, you know, package up and go ahead and get a top tier player, which we're not going to tell you who those are because why? You got to buy the 2016 fantasy football guide, right? Right?
Well, we can give a little bit more than that because I think one of the other factors you need to consider with the Calgary Stampeders is the Canadian portion of that and where they're going to be starting Canadians. Obviously, the Stampeders have had it very good the last number of years with John Cornish as their starting running back. They want to keep a national as a starting running back, and that's why Jerome Messam was acquired late in the season. But you look at the emergence of Lamar Durant, you consider, and I know it's going to be someone that is really tough to predict, and we'll talk about him also, and maybe we can move on to him next, and that's Anthony Parker, because you have 2 Canadians in the receiving group. You've got what they've got in the offensive line for starters. On the defense, the Stampeders last season had a couple of starters on the defensive line that were Canadian, and then there's the potential that maybe they'll start a Canadian in the linebacker group after taking Alex Singleton in the first round of the CFL draft. So there's lots of options with the Canadian spots for the Stampeders, and as the season goes on, a couple of Stampeders names that also are in that backfield are Torrey Harrison, running back that was with Stampeders last season and was a great second option for them. And a third name is a former standout at Baylor University by the name of Lake Seastrunk. And Seastrunk is a guy that has really impressed at Stampeders camp. He comes from a big name college. He comes with kind of everything that you're looking for as a star running back. And I think as the season goes on, if Messam's not performing, you might see the juggling with the ratio in Calgary.
All right, and that'll wrap that one up as we move on to Anthony Parker, a 2011 first-round draft pick in the CFL draft, and a guy who really, we talked about it in the guide. If you look at the profile, we kind of tease this a little bit, and we're just, we're not really sure where he does fit into the receiving core. If you do look at a lot of the other pieces in there, including your Greg Wilsons and Kamar Jordans and things like that, we're not really sure where Anthony Parker does fit into the lineup. And even though he's a Canadian, even though he does have talent, he does have speed, you would figure, Dan, the stats guy, at this point in his career, he should solidify a starting role somewhere and be able to already be making an impact in the league, no?
Well, and you look at the Stampeders there, and it's an embarrassment of riches at the Canadian receiver position. Lamar Durant is going to be an absolute stud in the CFL, maybe even starting as early as this season. I think Lamar Durant, the Stampeders want him to be one of their starting receivers, a guy that really breaks out this year. They have high hopes for him. Another name not to forget about is Simone Charbonneau-Campo. Missed all of last season. He's one of those receivers that, is extremely dependable, great hands, a guy that can play all the receiver positions. So yeah, that leaves Parker, and obviously he's shown that he can be a performer, but it's just, you're left scratching your head. Last season, one start, and whether or not he breaks out and does grab a starting position. Anthony Parker is just a tough player to predict, and as a result, you could also see his fantasy numbers go down this year from last season.
There's a tendency for those deep drafts in a 6-receiver league that an Anthony Parker could have round out your final round. And I guess to wrap that part up on Mr. Parker, that we would probably say he's a guy who's going to frustrate you and avoid. A guy who probably frustrated you last year because looking at his stats, he was almost Mr. Automatic over so many past years, and that's Rene Paredes. And we're saying he might be a guy who could be on the downswing over this season and going forward.
And one of the factors with that is he's in a non-import or a international kicker an import/an international kicker in the Calgary lineup. And if you're playing in a ratio league, that's something that you often have to look at is which Canadians do I add and start and things like that. And one other thing with Rene Paredes that has nothing to do with talent, nothing to do with how the Stampeders even view him as a kicker. Last season, the Stampeders led the league in going for it with a 2-point conversion. The Stampeders, I can't remember the exact number. I want to say they went for it or made 12 2-point conversions last year. And as a result, that left Paredes on the bench when the Stampeders would score a touchdown. Those are points that in a tight week, you're going to want an extra point. And if he's not on the field to kick it, then there goes your opportunity. There's other teams in the league that, even though they moved the extra point convert try back, they still on every one just about went for the 1 point instead of 2. So consider that. He's going to have less extra point numbers than the rest of the kickers in the league, and as a result, lower fantasy numbers. Yeah,
he may actually also have more opportunities for field goals potentially this year, depending on where the Calgary Stampeders offense does rank up. But we do see them as having a little bit of struggle. So he'll be tested on a number of levels. Will Rene Paredes, the once Mr. Automatic, and a guy who once was crowned Mr. Sack, pretty much. You couldn't double or triple team him and keep him away from your quarterback. He would devour him, eat his leg, and go for a jog around the field, and that's none other than 39 off the bookend.
Yeah, Charleston Hughes is an interesting one because, it's whether it is his talent level or his age has started to catch up with him, or if it is because of these injuries that he has had a couple of seasons where he just hasn't produced. And as a fantasy owner, you're looking for someone that's going to be dependable. With the Calgary defense, I can see it where Hughes is going to be pushed this year also by a couple of young defensive linemen the Stampeders have brought into training camp. With his case, only 10 sacks last year, I just have a tough time trusting Charleston Hughes. He might prove us wrong and have a great season and lead the league in sacks, but because of those injuries and because the production has been down the last couple seasons, unless you really want to be hitting your head against the wall because you're not getting production from him, I just would stay away from Charleston Hughes in 2016.
In his 8 seasons in the CFL, he's played 1 full year in 2012. He had 11 sacks, 18 in 2013 through 16 games. And as Dan, the stats guy, mentioned, 10 last year. Charleston Hughes is a guy I had in my lineup last season. And yeah, I was a little frustrated with him. So, Mr. Hughes, we welcome you to prove us wrong. But if you're a fantasy football owner, we would definitely suggest he's a guy that you can still pick, but definitely not in the first 9-10 rounds like you would have probably last year. Another bookend that was once crowned the mayor of Swaggerville, Mr. Commonwealth, and he might be on his way out the door eventually. We would forecast potentially as Mr. Odell Willis, who got into a little bit of trouble on the sidelines last year with the Edmonton Eskimos and got into Chris Jones's doghouse. But new coaching staff and Odell Willis might have one more kick at the can on that fierce Edmonton front four.
Yeah, you look at those 4 defensive linemen on the Eskimos, and all of them are kind of hitting that point where put up or shut up or getting shipped out. And obviously they had the Grey Cup year, and they have that on that ring on their finger, and all the kudos to them. But Odell Willis, really from a fantasy perspective last year, 29 tackles, 9 sacks. He's not in that top tier that he once was. And I think with him, maybe that was Chris Jones's defense and how they used so many defensive linemen. But keep in mind also, Marcus Howard only played 12 games for the Eskimos last year. And so that's one guy out of the rotation that was essentially a starter for the Eskimos. Odell Willis, I see him kind of this as one last opportunity for him, last crack at the Grey Cup. But unfortunately for him, this might be the end of the line.
Yeah, been able to remain relatively healthy. Played 18 games 3 out of the last 5 seasons. Only missed 3 games over the last 5 seasons as well. And again, defensive end. I guess it just worked out by coincidence that we're picking on defensive ends. Here's a guy that, in a ratio situation, fans love to hate and love to have him on their team. And he'll bury you if you're playing against him and you hate to pick him, but he'll also drive you nuts. He's a Canadian, Ricky Foley, out of the Toronto Argos. And he's a guy that likely will be on the downswing of his career and will probably frustrate you this season.
Ricky Foley last season did have 45 tackles, but only 6 sacks. And if you're picking a defensive end, you want somebody that's getting those extra points from sacks. That's your moneymaker from defensive ends. And yeah, unfortunately for Ricky Foley, not the same numbers he's put up earlier in the season, but if you're considering taking Ricky Foley, what you do know, and it has been that way for about most of his career, he does get tackles. And in Rich Stubler's system with the Argonauts this year, he'll continue to get tackles. His passport is going to keep him in the lineup. That's going to guarantee you starts from him. But the Argonauts also have, like the Stampeders, a couple of young defensive ends that are coming to camp that have really impressed. And there might be a potential for a ratio swing to another position with the Argonauts, as they do have a lot of Canadian talent at other positions. Maybe they move Ricky Foley more into a backup role later in his career here and elect to go with a Canadian in another spot and move one of those young defensive ends into the starting lineup.
Let's not forget one big factor as well, that due to the parity we foresee in the CFL this season, somebody's got to lose games. And we do see the Toronto Argos as one of those teams. And because of that, they might have the propensity to roll in younger guys through the lineup, as teams always do in any sport, if you have watched any sport ever before. So Ricky Foley could be one of the guys on the outside looking in because of that. And whoa, this is just a show full of segues. It's just going like butter from one player to another. And another guy who could be on the outside looking in, and Dan the Stats Guy and I are both very confused as to how maybe he hasn't even been released yet from the Montreal Alouettes because of the wealth of talent they have at linebacker.
Yeah, Chip Cox is an interesting name because, he's a linebacker for, I don't know how many years. I want to say about 8 years. He has been probably one of the most consistent performers if you draft him as a linebacker. Constantly over 100 tackles every year, sacks, forced fumbles, interceptions, everything you want, flies around the field. He's obviously just an undersized guy that just has so much speed. But Chip Cox is into his 11th season in the CFL, moving towards later in his career. He's back with the Alouettes again. But look at last year. Winston Venable, over 100 tackles. Bear Woods the year before, over 100 tackles. And a name last year that a lot of people were impressed by, Winston Venable, who really made a name for himself filling in for Bear Woods. And don't forget about Marc-Olivier Brouillette. He has the potential to play the linebacker position and maybe move down and let the Alouettes to play a safety with an American spot. So there's options for the Alouettes. I know starting on Wednesday here against the Blue Bombers, I'm going to see who they're going to be using on defense and see who's going to step up, because already the Alouettes let go of Enoch Mwamba. Chip Cox is another big money name, a guy that's been around the program for a number of years. Obviously, he's a great leader and somebody that is great for that locker room and has been there through their great cup runs. But it's just tough for me to really trust Chip Cox from a fantasy standpoint.
The Jim Pop factor, don't forget about that one. Known to make some moves that you go, huh? What just happened? So this could be one of those situations. They do keep Chip Cox around. Maybe they release him in training camp. That's what we've been waiting for. We look at his sack numbers, 4 sacks of the last 2 seasons, 12 in 2013, a massive year for sacks for Chip Cox that season. But other than that, as Dan mentioned, tackle numbers are pretty consistent. But Chip Cox is a guy that we will tell you are likely going to have some problems, and he will frustrate you this season. Last year, the CFL put out one of their, I believe it was last year, maybe the year before, they had the awards for, it was last year, the Ball Hawks, the best Ball Hawks in the CFL. And Patrick Watkins was in that category of guys, and he has had that, had that reputation from his days in the NFL as Toronto, when he burst onto the scene in the CFL with the Toronto Argos. He was fantastic there. Pat Watkins is a guy that we feel, though, that he could cause you some problems and frustrate you this season.
You know, last season, you look at the Alouettes on their defense, and I think with Pat Watkins, something to consider too is the younger players that are going to be around him. I know for you kind of question his coverage skills, but the Eskimos are going to be bringing in some young players to replace Aaron Grimes and Otha Foster and Dexter McCoyle in their defense. And so in that passing defense, there's other guys that could be picked on. And so maybe not so much on Watkins' ability, but I think even more just on who the quarterbacks target. You talk about receivers with the number of targets they get, defensive players as well. And I know John Ojo last year, as an owner of John Ojo in fantasy, it was a little bit frustrating because quarterbacks just stayed away from him. And when they did throw to John Ojo, the pass was picked off. 5 times last season. And I think in the case of Patrick Watkins this year, he had 67 tackles, 4 interceptions, great fantasy numbers. But I think it's more so in the sense of he's just not going to be thrown to as much, and that there might be a little bit more towards the slot backs rather than to the outside receivers, as Watkins is a corner. You're going to see offenses trying to stay away from Watkins. Doesn't
matter what sport you're a fan of. There's one thing that all fantasy players love. It's consistency. And Patrick Watkins is one thing we're saying for this year is a guy who likely isn't going to get you consistent points. He'll probably frustrate you. So that is a guy that you probably want to avoid. And out of our 10 to round it off is a guy in Hamilton. And I know the quarterback situation is 100% yet to be determined, and it will fluctuate throughout the year. But somebody, due to the new bodies they brought in, and a lot of up-and-coming receivers who probably won't see as many balls anymore, and he did come in and out of the lineup last year.
Well, and in that Hamilton group, don't forget about the Zach Collaros factor. Collaros, who's going to be out until probably the middle of the summer. The Hamilton offense brings in Chad Owens. They keep the long-serving guys in Andy Fantus and a couple others. Taquan Underwood, as you mentioned, he was in there. He has the big hair. He's a big target. He was often the deep target for the Hamilton Ticats. And what is Chad Owens known for? Going deep and catching the big pass of 40 yards and more. So Underwood's going to be an interesting one to watch for. And don't forget about the Canadian ratio again with the Tiger Cats, as there's a name, Spencer Watt, that people are going to remember. Watt last season missed all of the season with an injury, and he comes back in there. He's got an opportunity to start. He was a good performer for the Toronto Argonauts back in the day. So between those two, there's going to be a bit of battle. And if they elect to go with the Canadian, they may go with Watt. If they elect to go with the international, then it could be Taquan Underwood. But just whether or not he gets the targets.
Underwood, 557 yards, 3 touchdowns last year. And there's some other big names in there that you'll have to buy the 2016 Fantasy Guide to find out about as well. Hey, you know what? We put it all the work together. We could give you all the answers on the podcast, but we'd prefer if you buy the guide. I'm just saying, right? Is that okay to do?
Well, we have to pay the bills. We have to, pay for the lighting, the electrical, and the on-site headquarters that...
Not to mention producer Dan is a bit of a diva. He always wants like a new pair of shoes, a new coffee, like a new jacket every week. So that gets pretty expensive.
Yeah, just a lot of things that we need to be paying for. So, help us out, give us the $20 and enjoy winning your league this year.
Don't forget, Engineer Ben has a bit of a rage problem, so he punches and hammers on a lot of things. Don Cherry is...
Yeah, he's still having to pay off the damage that he did at last week's Brandon Banks going away pool party that we got a lot of feedback about.
We still haven't seen Engineer Ben. We're not sure where he is. He's somewhere on a boat from Brandon Banks' going away pool party. And producer
Just
Dan...
like the Tiger Cats haven't seen Brandon Banks yet.
Producer Dan just put up on a board here that Don Cherry is his tailor. So if we're going to be getting Don, he needs the Skrilla. He needs a Skrilla to pay the bill. All right. A guy who's paid some bills last year for the Ottawa Redblacks. Boy, what a season did he ever have as we move into 5 guys that can only go down from here because we feel they might have reached their performance peak last year, or they might have reached their peak and on their way down a little bit. And none other than the gunslinger who's number 1, 1A, 1B. He's number 1 in Ottawa.
Yeah, the most outstanding player in 2015, Henry Burris. I mean, it's not that we're saying that Burris is going to be in the bottom rung of quarterbacks. Henry Burris is still going to be one of the first couple of quarterbacks you're going to want to take off the board. But look at last season, 5,703 yards, 26 touchdowns, 13 interceptions, 274 yards rushing, and 7 touchdowns on the ground. He was the big fantasy point producer amongst quarterbacks last season. But you have to consider that Ottawa offense. 4 receivers with over 1,000 yards receiving. And I think that is just something that you don't see every year. You think back to the Montreal Alouettes teams about 8 or 9 years ago, or as recent as 4 or 5 years ago. They did it, but that wasn't something that was consistent year after year. They would have 1 year and then there'd be a down year. And I just look at the Ottawa Redblacks this year. I think teams are going to be a little bit ready. Don't forget about injuries as well, as that is also a factor that could come into play here. So it's not that Henry Burris is going to be severely down. He's just not going to be putting up those huge numbers again.
Dan is the stats guy. That's what we call him, Dan the stats guy. And the stats don't lie. I'm looking at Henry Burris's career roster. Only twice in his entire career, that exciting that my voice actually cracked. I just hit puberty again, or around 32 years. But so only twice in his entire career has he not played an 18-game season. 2005, 16 games. 2007, 16 games. Mind-blowing. Absolutely mind-blowing.
He's gonna be a guy that's not gonna get injured. He's a durable quarterback. You look at the quarterbacks the last number of years that have been injured, he's stayed in there. So he's gonna be durable, but it is that factor of those around him, whether or not they stay healthy. And one other thing, maybe the Redblacks start phasing him out of the short yardage. A lot of teams do that. They'll bring in another quarterback. And who did the Redblacks sign this year, Dave, that has a perfect opportunity to be the short yardage quarterback?
Great question. Trevor Harris.
Trevor Harris.
He's the answer.
Trevor Harris.
I thought you were trying to stump me. I'm like, is there a 5th string quarterback somewhere that I didn't realize? But Trevor Harris, he's the easy answer. He's the guy who will be the heir apparent.
Well, and Harris did that role behind Ricky Ray in Toronto. So I think if the Redblacks want to get Trevor Harris involved in the offense, there's a perfect opportunity. Bring him in as a short yardage quarterback. Take down the number of hits that Burris is taking in those short yardage situations. And there you go. Henry Burris's stats, just by a little, are going to be down in 2016.
Turned 41 a short month ago, Henry Burris did. And I'm 37 and I feel like I'm 105. I'm just telling you, after one of these shows, I sleep for about 48 hours. After that, we move a little further east. And a guy who moved east again when he came west a couple of short seasons ago. None other than Kenny Stafford, who is in a very loaded receiving group with some questions at quarterback.
3 receivers that are going to be down in this block here, and Kenny Stafford is the first one. The biggest stat to look at with Kenny Stafford last season was his red zone numbers. Stafford finished the season with the Eskimos, and most of those passes coming from Mike Riley, with 9 touchdowns. 47 catches, 9 touchdowns. You don't see that kind of a ratio with most players. It was just for him that he just got into the right place at the right time. One of the factors that you talk about those advanced stats and key things and to look at with different positions and different players. Kenny Stafford in 2015 did have those 9 touchdowns, but he had the lowest yards after the catch numbers of any player coming back in 2016. So it was meaning that he was getting the catch and immediately getting tackled. And in a lot of cases, obviously, it was on touchdowns. But if you're depending on a player to get you those points from touchdowns, you're going to be struggling if he doesn't perform like that, as maybe he has the same number of yards but less touchdowns. It could be really frustrating, which leads right into the next guy from the Toronto Argonauts.
Yeah, there's nothing that feels better, more exciting than when a player can catch a 50, 60-yard touchdown and then you watch the guy you're playing against and he puts his head in his hands. I was a Torrey Gurley owner last year, and he's a guy that I jumped up and down and watched the people I was playing against have those moments of, oh no. And Torrey Gurley tied for the league lead in touchdowns last year, but we're not expecting to see that from him this year.
You know, I think Ricky Ray is a guy that will work the ball around. He's a bit of a technician in terms of taking apart defenses, and he's done that his entire career. And I think when you look at Torrey Gurley, he's going to have probably a similar, if not more, yards receiving. When you consider that Toronto group, he is a stud. We put him on the cover of the 2016 Fantasy Guide. But if you're going to be expecting him to get 10 touchdowns a year and be up there in the top 10 or top 5 amongst fantasy receivers, you're in for a long year, because there's a lot of talent in Toronto. Don't forget about Vidal Hazelton. Don't forget about Kevin Elliott. And especially do not forget about Deontay Spencer in that Argos receiving group.
Yeah, definitely loaded at receiver, and some guys that are coming in and out of there as well. And Torrey Gurley is one that, again, this category isn't guys you should avoid or whatever, but guys who will likely start trending down from their stats and probably either have peaked or for whatever reason we're exposing holes as to why those stats could be inflated. And I think Kenny Stafford is probably the poster boy for this category. A guy that burst onto the scene last year because of a wealth of injuries for the Edmonton Eskimos, and boy, were they happy to insert him into the lineup, Mr. Darrell Walker, and he became a big fan of Chris Jones, Mike Riley, and jerseys everywhere popping around in the Alberta capital. And Darrell Walker, huge numbers this year, we might say, because of a new head coach, a new offensive coordinator, those numbers might go down.
We talked about already that Ottawa Redblacks offense last year where Henry Burris put up the big yards with 4 1,000-yard receivers. Now, Jason Moss, the offensive coordinator in Ottawa, makes his way to Edmonton where he'll be the head coach and calling the plays. I see a similar thing where the Eskimos maybe work the ball around a little bit more. Darrell Walker, in 12 games, 1,110 yards, 6 touchdowns. Is he going to have 1,100 yards again this year? I have a tough time believing that, especially when you consider how balanced the Ottawa offense was last season. I think Walker is going to be in your top 10 receivers, but if you expect him that, looking at it, okay, 12 games, he had 1,100 yards. Is he due for a 1,400 or 1,500 yard season? I have a tough time believing that, especially when Darius Bowman is the big target in Edmonton. He's a bigger target for Mike Riley right away. They have that chemistry that's gone on for a number of years. And then you look at the other weapons in that Edmonton offense at receiver, where you have the trio of Canadians, and I'm sure we're going to hear it from Rod Black all year, of the Canadian Air Force in Edmonton. I'm sure we're going to get that maybe even as early as the preseason. If the I'm not sure if the Eskimos are one of the games televised, but I think when you consider Chris Getzlaff and his sure hands over the middle, you consider Nate Kuhorn, who's going to battle for first downs and be a target that I think is going to be in for a better year than last season. just by way of loan of Jason Moss trusting a receiver like that. Look at Greg Ellinson as the comparison in Ottawa to Kuhorn, and then also Corey Watson and the rookie Jacoby Ford, who comes from the NFL with a huge pedigree and a pile of talent and speed. So Darrell Walker is going to have a good year still. He's going to be somebody that the Eskimos are going to use, and I think he might use that to move himself into an NFL contract, but just don't expect him to be a top 3 receiver in the league based on last year's stats alone.
Let's not forget the top 5 receivers at Edmonton last year were Bowman, Walker, and Bowman. So that likely will change, as Dan, the stats guy, did mention it. Last but not least from this category, you know what? It doesn't matter if you were a fan of his or you weren't. I think just the emotion behind the way the story played out, coming back in the lineup, rejuvenating his career. I think every CFL fan cheered for this guy, and that's John Bowman, defensive end for the Montreal Alouettes. Boy, was that ever great to see him come back and another opportunity to make an impact after they felt that, you know, he was on the downswing of his career. But after putting up the numbers he did last year, we feel John Bowman likely won't hit that point again.
You could probably vouch for me on this, Dave. I think I've owned John Bowman in fantasy.ca leagues for probably about 5 years straight. Yep. I think I've drafted him every year. And with John Bowman, you got the same production year after year after year. And one of the factors to consider with the Alouettes is Gabriel Napton at the other end. And he's going to be a stud in 2016. He's already shown that. We talk about it in his write-up. He looks like he should be a member of the Legion of Doom, coming across the line and bringing doom and gloom to quarterbacks around the CFL. John Bowman is a guy that I've really enjoyed owning. You know, I kind of look at this as a going away speech or whatever, but he's going to be down from those 19 sacks. He's not going to put up 19 sacks again. I have a tough time believing that. And I think when at the end of the day, especially if you're in a keeper league, John Bowman, this could be his last year, because the Alouettes signed Von Martin, a Canadian, at the defensive tackle spot to a massive contract. And Jim Popp is going to need to make some moves either early in the season or as the season goes on when they start losing. And I'm sure you're going to agree with me on that, Dave, that the Alouettes will struggle a little bit in 2016. That John Bowman's going to be one of those guys that I think when they go onto the whiteboard, Jim Popp's going to consider John Bowman's contract and what he gives. And unless he's giving the same kind of season, then he's going to be on his way out of Montreal.
Somebody's got to lose. That's essentially the theme for this CFL season. If you've on the inner workings of any of the conversations Dan the Stats Guy and I have off the air, somebody's got to lose. There's going to be so much parity in the CFL this year. You thought last year's offenses were exciting? This year is going to be fantastic. We can't wait for the preseason to kick off on Wednesday, June 8th, with the Alouettes and the Bombers. And I guess, yeah.
And you talk, and I'll just jump in there with that, Dave. You talk about the offenses, and since the Red Blacks came in 2 years ago, there's been sort of a drop in the amount of production, and people have said that because you add a team, there's less talent. I think what you're going to get more and more now as teams start filling out their rosters and start giving guys experience in the lineups, I think you're going to see offenses putting more points on the board, and you're going to see them getting their offensive numbers as a whole in the CFL up to numbers that you haven't seen in probably 6 or 7 years in the league.
Looking forward to that. Looking forward to the air attack and the run game this season. And boy, were we looking forward to releasing the 2016 CFL Fantasy Football Guide, the Onside CFL Fantasy Football Guide, which you can find the link on Onside CFL.wordpress.com, and a lot of buzz throughout social media today via Facebook. You can like us on Facebook as well, and obviously on Twitter. Oh boy, did we ever have some the place shaken on Twitter today.
Yeah, a lot of people, asking different questions about where to buy and how to buy. And it's, like you say, a simple process. Go on to onsidecfl.wordpress.com. There'll be a link there for you to buy now. And through a credit card or PayPal, I think every credit card on there I looked on, I think you can even put in the Discover card if you have a Discover card still. I didn't know that people still use those.
Discovering new things.
Discovering new things as a result of putting out the fantasy guide. One of the things we've also got feedback on, and I think I mentioned it earlier, is the casual fan, maybe somebody that doesn't play fantasy football might be interested in that. And if you're someone that listens to the different podcasts around the league and watches the game fairly closely but doesn't do fantasy football and just wants information on different players and who to watch on the different teams, it's a good read for you and something that you can have next to you as you watch a CFL game during the season.
Yeah, we've had a lot of faithful listeners over the years from the Rouge Radio days, even back to the Swagger and Stagger show days. We've been through that many format flips. And this one we're excited about. Dylan B_27 is a guy I want to give a shout out to, has faithfully followed us along and seeked out our fantasy football advice. And a guy that I know bought a guide today as well. There's so many media people that help to bring this reality and kind of bring it to life and help us to get the word out today. Guys like Darren Bombing, Dave Campbell, Scott Mitchell, Rod Peterson, Andrew Buchholz, and Kelly Friesen as well. A number of names in there. And my mind slips me here. I'm trying to think of anybody else who can help get the word out today. Any media people who we talked to over the past couple of days.
We've also talked to a couple of the other podcasts. I know we've got contacts with a pile of the different podcasts, and this afternoon had a bit of a conversation with John Fraser, the 2-0 podcast. And I told him last week I wanted to give them a shout out, and I completely forgot the name of their podcast. I was sitting there and I was going to give them a shout out, but I completely forgot the name of their podcast. And I know they also talk fantasy, and what we're seeing throughout this week as well is those guys have said that they're going to give it a shout out. So we're going to give a shout out right back to those podcasts, 2-0 podcast, the Rouge Radio podcast. Give a listen to those podcasts this week and in previous weeks. They've been doing their CFL previews on each of the 9 teams in the league and how they see it. We see it a certain way from a fantasy perspective. The 2-0 guys do look at it from a fantasy perspective, but they also look at it from a standings and which teams are going to fit where and where they kind of see things unfolding. And then also the new Rouge Radio guys, they also are giving their way that they're seeing the standings. It's interesting to watch. I think if you put 50 people or 100 people in the room, you could have 100 different views on how the 2016 season is going to go, just from, like we talked about, the amount of parity that's going to be there and the amount of talent that's coming into the league this year. It's going to be a fun year to watch, and it's going to be interesting to see which podcasts are right. But like I said, give those guys a listen, give them a follow. And with each of us, follow us on iTunes, follow us on Google Play, give us a review, give us a 5-star rating if you love us. We're also available on Stitcher, on TuneIn, and then obviously on the SoundCloud. So lots of places to listen to a lot of podcasts from the CFL. Make sure that you give us a follow and give us a 5-star review so that we can move up higher and higher in the rankings and maybe move ahead of some NFL podcasts. Maybe if people search NFL, they'll start getting CFL podcasts at the top of the list.
How jacked up is Dan the Stats Guy? I didn't know if I had a chance to talk again the rest of the show. He just kept carrying on and on and on. Producer
I'm
Dan's
excited about the pod.
Producer Dan's writing things on the board.
He's
like, talk about this thing. Okay, Dan's talking about. Talk about that. Dan's talking about that. Okay, scratch off the board, off the board, off the board, off the board. It's great stuff. Great podcast community. Dan's going to be on the Tune Out podcast in the future. I'll be on the BC Lions, Dan, and this week you can hear me on Rouge Radio. Shout out to Andrew Hoskins at Eskimo Empire as well. Does a great job there. Kevin Jesus, want to give him a shout out too for helping us with the editing of our 2016 Onside CFL Fantasy Football Guide. 2 guys we didn't give a shout out to, well, recently, and they're sitting here. Engineer Ben's got he doesn't have a gun. That'll make him sound like scary and intimidating, and someone's going to want to come arrest him. But Engineer Ben's a hardworking guy, does all the editing for our show, as well as producer Dan is the brains behind it. Follow us on Twitter at CFL Fantasy FTB. You can follow Dan on Twitter at Dan_UK1. He's Dan the Stats Guy. Myself at Dave Dawson 7. We're on iTunes. We're on Google Play. We're on pretty much every medium you can imagine. And now we're on our way to watching some preseason football this week. Cannot wait for the fantasy football season. On behalf of Dan the Stats Guy, say good night. And we're going to take Lower Your Weapons by Revolution Engine, and we're going to kick back and have a beer. We'll see you next week.